From the beginning of September, everything would change, with stars etched into the coasts of Mississippi and Louisiana that last to this day. In late August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina brought its wrath to the Florida Peninsula and to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi and Louisiana, with Louisiana, specifically New Orleans, suffering the worst of the storm. Hurricane Katrina's toll on the coasts of Mississippi and Louisiana was beyond comprehension, with nothing but pure devastation observed in Mississippi, but New Orleans, to put it lightly, saw the absolute worst of the damage. The levee system in New Orleans failed, leading to 80% of the city being submerged underwater. The government response to Katrina after the fact is considered to be the worst government response to a natural disaster in U.S. history. Hurricane Katrina has garnered a reputation for being the most infamous hurricane in U.S. history, and it's obvious as to why. I mean, it's far and away the most expensive hurricane in U.S. history, tied with Hurricane Harvey of 2017. Everybody knows about Hurricane Katrina and are already aware of what I just told you. But today, I want to look deeper into Hurricane Katrina, looking deeper into how the meteorological development of Hurricane Katrina occurred and how the response failed. So today, I will be taking a deep dive into Hurricane Katrina, going over the state of the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season thus far, the origins, the forecast, the preparations taken, the storm's impacts on the areas it traveled across, the aftermath and failed response to Hurricane Katrina from the government, and the legacy that the storm has. Welcome to Nature's Fury. The 2005 Atlantic hurricane season was already extremely active by the time Katrina formed. To be fair, the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season would end up going down as the most active year for tropical cyclones in the northern Atlantic until 2020, at least in terms of named storms. Before Katrina formed, there were 10 named storms plus one unnamed depression that formed in the Atlantic basin, 2 of those being major hurricanes. The first major hurricane of the season was Hurricane Dennis, a high-end Category 4 hurricane that slammed into Cuba and the Gulf Coast of the United States. While Dennis did weaken before its landfall in the United States, Hurricane Dennis's impacts to Cuba and the United States led the storm to be retired. The second major storm was Hurricane Emily, the earliest Category 5 hurricane during the calendar year in the Atlantic basin, peaking in the Caribbean Sea before making landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula as a Category 4 hurricane. The hurricane emerged off the coast of Mexico and made a second landfall as a Category 3 hurricane near San Fernando, Mexico. To this day, Hurricane Emily remains one of very few Category 5 hurricanes to not have its name retired. From then on, the Atlantic Ocean continued to churn out tropical cyclones, but none were major. But of course, coming into mid to late August, another tropical system would begin to organize off the coast of Florida, and would be given a name that would go down in infamy. But real quick, only a small portion of the people who like these weather documentaries are subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content I create, consider subscribing. It helps support what I do and tells me I'm doing something right. Also, I have a Discord server that I frequently talk in, link to that is in the description. Anyways, back to Hurricane Katrina. Katrina's origins as a tropical system were more complex than most tropical cyclones that form in the northern Atlantic. Katrina's formation was the result of the interactions of a tropical wave, the mid-level remnants of Tropical Depression 10, and an upper-level trough. On August 11th, a tropical wave exited the coast of Africa and moved through the main development region of the Atlantic Ocean over the next few days. While the wave was crossing across the MDR, on August 14th, a strong upper-level trough located across the western Atlantic and the Bahamas created strong westerly shear across Tropical Depression 10, causing it to dissipate. The low-level circulation, however, persisted, moving westward while gradually weakening before dissipating near Cuba on August 21st. The mid-level circulation that originated from Tropical Depression 10 lagged behind the low-level circulation. Eventually, the mid-level circulation merged with the tropical wave that left the coast of Africa. The wave proceeded to produce a large area of showers and thunderstorms north of Puerto Rico, moving towards the northwest before consolidating east of the Turks and Caicos Islands. At the same time, the upper-level trough began to weaken as it moved westward into Florida, allowing for the tropical wave to develop due to the lack of wind shear associated with the trough. By 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 23rd, the system was designated as Tropical Depression 12. During the overnight hours, the depression became better organized, and at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 24th, the depression was upgraded to a tropical storm and given the name Katrina. As Katrina developed off the coast of Florida, Katrina came under the influence of a strengthening mid to upper level ridge over the northern Gulf of Mexico and southern United States. This ridge would be responsible for turning Katrina westward, and that was represented well in the forecasts. The National Hurricane Center predicted that Katrina would move over the southern Florida Peninsula at a slow pace, projected to make landfall as a Category 1 hurricane and cross over into the Gulf of Mexico. As to what was expected once it went into the Gulf of Mexico, that was uncertain. Original forecasts called for a landfall ranging from the western coast of the Florida Peninsula all the way into portions of Alabama. Long-term forecasts were uncertain, but in the short term, the threat was for Florida. As Katrina turned westward, tropical storm watches and warnings and hurricane warnings were issued for the Florida coastline. In advance of the storm's landfall, Florida Governor Jeb Bush issued a state of emergency on August 24th, with Florida's Emergency Operations Center being activated in Tallahassee. Schools and businesses began closing in the Miami metro area. Cruise ships altered their paths due to the seaports in Florida closing, and airports across southern Florida were closed. Residents in Florida began stocking up on supplies, and gas shortages were an expected issue across Florida due to limited supply. Evacuation orders were issued across portions of Florida, and emergency shelters were opened in preparation for Katrina. Preparations were quick due to how close Katrina was to the coast of Florida by the time warnings were issued, and it was only a matter of time before Katrina would land its first punch. While Katrina was turning towards the Florida coastline, the storm was already bringing impacts in portions of the Bahamas. Thankfully, the Bahamas had minimal impacts from Katrina. Before landfall, Katrina strengthened to a Category 1 hurricane, making landfall around 4:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in southern Florida with winds of 80 miles per hour. The storm had an asymmetrical structure as it came ashore, with the heaviest rain and the strongest winds occurring to the south and east of the center. However, what Katrina is mostly remembered for in Florida was the severe flooding that occurred. Due to the asymmetrical structure of Katrina and the slow movement of the storm, flooding became an issue in far southern Florida. In extreme southern Florida, rainfall totals were in excess of 5 inches, with some areas seeing over 10 inches of rainfall. The maximum rainfall observed in Florida was in Perrine, Florida, with a total of 16.43 inches of rainfall falling due to Katrina in the city. A total of 14 deaths occurred in Florida. Of those, 6 were directly due to flooding, and the other 8 were indirect deaths. As Katrina moved across the Florida Peninsula and into the Gulf of Mexico, Katrina weakened down to a bare minimum Category 1 hurricane with winds of 75 miles per hour. The storm continued to become more organized, gradually strengthening after moving over the Florida Keys. Its strengthening was limited, however, due to Katrina undergoing an eyewall replacement cycle. As Katrina continued moving towards the west-southwest, the National Hurricane Center realized that Katrina was not going to aim for the Florida Panhandle. What they began to suspect was a landfall a bit further to the west than that, somewhere along the Louisiana and Alabama Gulf Coast, putting the city of New Orleans directly in its path. Shortly after the forecast was adjusted, Katrina would complete its eyewall replacement cycle and would explode in intensity, rapidly intensifying from a Category 3 hurricane to a 175-mile-per-hour Category 5 hurricane, and in its crosshairs was New Orleans, Louisiana. Regardless of Katrina's strength at landfall, governments at all levels knew evacuations had to begin with the utmost urgency, and in some cases should have already been underway. However, it was abundantly clear in the days that followed that there was a major discrepancy between what officials said and what they actually did in preparation for the disaster which was approaching fast. Frankly, to call it a dumpster fire would be giving officials too much credit for their work, which we will see very shortly. The response to Hurricane Katrina, both in preparations and during the aftermath, is often referred to as the worst government response to a natural disaster in U.S. history. That is an understatement, but it's during this segment where I want to go more in depth with what went wrong during preparations, what went right, and the glaring problem that was staring New Orleans right in the face, the levee system. Let's begin with a timeline of events. After Katrina strengthened to a Category 3 hurricane, President George W. Bush declared a state of emergency in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi ahead of Katrina. According to the congressional report from the bipartisan committee established to investigate the government's response to Hurricane Katrina, preparations in Mississippi went rather well, at least in comparison to what occurred in Louisiana. Months leading up to the storm, county and state officials were prepared and underwent disaster response training. Ahead of Katrina, Mississippi established command structures by way of emergency proclamations, activated emergency operation centers, issued mandatory evacuation orders, opened emergency shelters, and mobilized the National Guard. Evacuations were the top priority, with the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency prioritizing evacuating the coastline before opening shelters, which they eventually did. Mississippi began monitoring Katrina as early as August 23rd, and emergency declarations and troops were deployed on August 26th. Alabama's response for Katrina was also, comparatively speaking, relatively smooth. Of course, after being battered with Hurricane Ivan the year previously, Alabama Emergency Management finalized preparations 4 days before landfall, issuing states of emergencies for the coastal counties. Basically, what happened in Mississippi in advance of Katrina also applied to Alabama, with Alabama also learning from their mistakes in communications because of Hurricanes Ivan and Dennis. Louisiana, being in the direct path of the storm, began commencing with their evacuation plan, with the Department of Transportation and the Louisiana State Police implementing contraflow, making all highway lanes outbound to maximize traffic flow, with the contraflow directing those evacuating into Texas and Mississippi. On the 27th, the National Guard began to be deployed across southeastern Louisiana, and up to 1.2 million Louisiana residents followed the evacuation orders. With Hurricane Katrina expected to make landfall as a Category 4 or 5 hurricane, many who could evacuate ahead of the storm did so. Storm surge was a prominent issue, with storm surge expected to be over 20 feet, which would overtop the levees and flood New Orleans. The levee system collapsing was not a major concern at the time. Very few truly expected the complete collapse of the levee system, although the warning signs of what was about to occur was in full display, but I'll get to that later. That all being said, thousands of residents, specifically in New Orleans, stayed in their homes. But why did many people remain where they were? There's a multitude of reasons, but let's go over the less significant reasons first and go from there. The first issue was the type of evacuation orders that were issued initially. Parishes in Louisiana began declaring evacuation orders as early as August 27th at 9 a.m., specifically beginning with the southernmost parishes, then moving northward to prevent traffic bottlenecks. However, the type of evacuation orders initially issued were not mandatory, but rather recommendatory. Eventually, the evacuation orders were upgraded to mandatory, but this caused some issues with messaging. The second issue was that Governor Blanco did not issue a state of emergency, but rather relied on the federal state of emergency declaration. The decision to not issue a local state of emergency meant that there was conflicting messaging regarding what to do ahead of Katrina and afterwards. However, the biggest issues with the preparations in Louisiana came out of New Orleans. In New Orleans, the mandatory evacuation order was issued extremely late, with Mayor Ray Nagin issuing a mandatory evacuation of the city only 20 hours before landfall. Critics argue that he should have issued it earlier, but at least it was declared. The city of New Orleans established several refuges of last resort for citizens, most notably the Superdome. Now, to be clear, 80% of the New Orleans metro area evacuated ahead of Katrina, but the issues with the preparations in Louisiana wasn't related to those who had the ability to evacuate, but rather the inaction done to help those who could not evacuate on their own. While most of New Orleans was able to evacuate, the evacuation plans did not benefit those who had the inability to evacuate on their own, specifically those in poverty, hospitals, and long-term caring facilities. People in those locations have to rely on outside help, whether that be the government, medical companies, or local groups in order to evacuate to a safer location. However, actions that could have been taken to help evacuate those who are most vulnerable to a storm like Katrina were not done. Long-term care facilities attempted to get in contact with buses and ambulances to get patients out, but many of those companies were unable to evacuate the residents. Fuel was in short supply, and many forms of public transportation were shut down before Katrina came ashore. But the most neglected populace of the New Orleans metro was those below the poverty line, specifically in the lower 9th Ward. Within Louisiana's Emergency Operations Plan, Supplement 1C and Part 2, Section 2, Paragraph D, the plan calls for the use of school buses and other public buses to evacuate those who cannot evacuate on their own. While there were buses publicly available to use to help people evacuate outside of the city or to emergency shelters, there was still a major problem. There weren't enough bus drivers. The issue of the lack of bus drivers could have been circumvented if the governor of Louisiana signed an emergency waiver that would declare that any licensed driver could drive a public bus to help aid with evacuation efforts. Governor Blanco did not sign that waiver, meaning that those in poverty, long-term care facilities, and hospitals were left with little to no assistance from the local governments, leaving them to fend for themselves. For those who stayed, they stocked up on supplies if they could, hoping for the best. However, the true worst-case scenario of the levee system breaking down was not a common concern for those in the path who weren't government officials. But the potential for the levee system breaking down almost completely was very real, and the issues surrounding the levee system were not very well known to residents until after the system had failed. In order to understand how catastrophic the failure of the levee system was, we need to understand the abhorrent conditions of the levee system itself during its construction to understand what happened in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. The New Orleans levee system began construction at least 35 years before Katrina struck, and in order to understand how it failed, we have to understand the mistakes and shortcuts taken during its construction. From there, it will become blatantly obvious why it ended up collapsing during Hurricane Katrina. There's a lot of engineering jargon in the ASCE report on the levee system from 2007, but I will try and simplify it the best I can. It's well known that the levee system was poorly constructed, but I cannot say it enough. The report itself establishes that the state of the levee system was far worse than what's commonly known. The New Orleans levee system, officially known as the New Orleans Hurricane Protection System, is made up of 3 main units: the Lake Pontchartrain, Louisiana, and Vicinity Hurricane Protection Project, the West Bank and Vicinity New Orleans, Louisiana Hurricane Protection Project, and the New Orleans to Venice, Louisiana Hurricane Protection Project. The protection projects consisted of 3 types of levees: earthen levees, which was most of the system, eye walls, and T-walls. You don't really need to know much about how they work entirely, you just need to know that the eye walls and T-walls were the ones that failed the most. In concept, relatively simple and easy to construct, from an engineering standpoint at least. However, as the ASCE report states, a multitude of problems surrounded the levee system's construction and maintenance, and let's take this issue by issue, starting with the funding and issues that come with it. The one in control of the funding of the majority of levee systems across the United States is the United States Army Corps of Engineers, the USACE for short. The USACE is, by all accounts, a bureaucratic agency under the Department of Defense. The USACE's position as a bureaucratic agency means that the budget the agency has changes each year because Congress is in charge of the federal budget every year. It is not consistent, and because bureaucracy, funding for projects done by the USACE has to be split up into multiple smaller projects. This applied to the New Orleans levee system. The system wasn't really a system, but a bunch of separate parts that varied in construction quality and maintenance, built in a piecemeal fashion. What this ultimately meant is that the weak levees that, for all intents and purposes, would fail replaced next to stronger levees which would normally not be susceptible to failure. Because of how the levees varied in size and height in such close proximity to each other, essentially, the strong levees were pointless as they would be overtaken due to floodwaters that overtopped the weaker levees. Not to mention that due to this funding system, portions of the levee system weren't built or even complete by the time Katrina hit. Remember, anything is only as strong as its weakest part. Just from the funding issue alone in the piecemeal structure, it would surprise no one how the levee system failed. And yet, it somehow gets worse.